Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and welcome this breakfast forum at Bergen Global. On September the 13th of this year, the 19-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman Masha Amini stepped out from the train and onto the streets of Tehran, where she had come to visit her family members. She was in the company of her brothers, and the two of them were quickly confronted by the so-called morality police, who insisted that Masha's outfit on that day did not conform to the standards of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Despite their pleading, Masha was taken away, and only 3 days later, the family was notified about her death in custody. This has sparked an immediate wave of protests across Iran, very often led by women who demonstrate by burning their hijabs, cutting off their hair in public, and also often joined by men, and especially young people, often students, whose ability to connect with the world through social media has been one of the driving forces. The regime has responded with severe repressive measures, during this past weekend even issuing, we can discuss that maybe, the first death penalty for an individual deemed to be responsible for instigating process. Now, this wave of uprising has been called both the beginning of the end of the Islamic Republic in its current form, and just another uprising in a series of protests in the past decade and a half at least. Today, we will learn more about what drives the current wave of protests, how or if it differs from earlier protests, and what is really at stake for Iranian women today. My name is Anne Bang. I'm a professor of Middle Eastern history at the University of Bergen and not a specialist on Iran. On the other hand, I have with me two extremely knowledgeable experts, I would say the foremost in Norway, who both follow the situation very closely. Marianne Bøe, who is a professor at the University of Stavanger and who has written on Iranian feminism, both in Iran and in the diaspora, and Gilda Siddiqui, who is a senior researcher at Vestlandsforskning and who has published very widely on the use of digital technologies and mobilization and activism in Iran. So welcome to both of you. We wanted to start with the present situation, and I would like to start by asking the same question basically to both of you. Why do you think this particular event triggered such a reaction? I mean, one must assume here that the death of Masha Amini came on top of layers and layers of frustration. How do you view this reaction? Marianne, or whoever wants to start, really.
Okay, should I start? Yeah, good question. I think Amini's, there are two aspects to Amini's death. As you described, she died after being in custody of the morality police. It was not that she did not comply with the mandatory use of hijab. She did, but like many other women in Iran, she wore a bad hijab. It was a bit too loose. She showed a bit too much hair, and that was the reason for her arrest. And I think when she died, this event triggered a situation, or yes, a situation that many women could relate to. And the hijab is one symbol of the systematic discrimination that women in Iran face on an everyday, daily basis. So I think it really triggered protest on the lack of rights, the lack of personal freedom, the lack of bodily autonomy. And then, as you explained as well, we've seen that not only women, but also men have joined the protest. So that is one aspect. And the other aspect, I think, is that Amini belonged to a Kurdish minority. And Iran, the government in Iran, they like to portray Iran as a Persian and Islamic nation, but this is far from the truth. It's a highly religious and ethnic diverse country. And the Kurdish group that Amini belongs to is one of the largest minority groups. And they have faced systematic discrimination as well throughout the modern history of Iran. So I think these two aspects really triggered the protests.
Yeah, I agree a lot with Marianne. But I'd like to answer a question with two questions. And the first one is that how a death becomes publicly known as an injustice, how that process happens. And if we look at this specific one, so we know that it was first written article about it in Iran by a woman journalist called Nilüfer Hamidi. She is imprisoned because of that, and the accusation is that she has caused because of what's the national security is in danger because of the articles she wrote. But if we go back to the type of articles she has written in the last 5 years, let us think, she often writes about articles that is around women's rights. She has, for example, an article about a woman that cannot enroll in at universities because they need confirmation or permission from their husbands. And about mothers that cannot take the examination grade for their children from schools because they need permission from their husbands. Another article, that article created a lot of debate in Iran, and it actually caused some changes in the regulation. Then she has written about, for example, abortion, illegal abortion, and how young women experience that in Iran. And we know that recently Iran changed rules related to screening of embryo, it's called the baby, the screening. And because of that, many believe that the illegal abortion will increase in Iran. So if we, first of all, we need journalists, people who can make a case out of an injustice, death, or situation. And in Iran, many of journalists are imprisoned because of the type of articles and news that they can publish. The another one, if we just look at the cases that she has written, we see that many of rights that women activists in Iran have fought for still are problems in Iran. And in addition, we have hardliners in power in the last years that have created even more rules that make life difficult for some Iranians, especially young women. And if we just look at the articles, we see that the point that make a lot of conflict and debate is the personal and individual rights of a body and for children, mother's life rights. Yeah, so that's one thing. Another is that how something is understood as injustice and can create a moment that people think they can represent the person that has lost their life and can seek justice for that person. So what is that the injustice they want to be changed? That is a huge question. I hope we can go back to it, but I just say very shortly about one aspect of it is about economic situation. If we can see this protest as a continuation of the protests, that one way of saying it, and the previous one was people from slum areas in Iran that wanted changes in political economy in Iran. And what was interesting, 1,500 people were killed during those protests. But one of the things that was interesting was that people from middle class and, for example, in Tehran, in areas that they are much richer than Shlom area, then they would say, we don't know these people, what they are talking about. Not, they couldn't feel the problem. But now we are in a situation that you can see people from middle class, from Zafaraniye in Tehran, you probably know about that very rich part of Tehran, to very, Shlom area can protest for the same injustice. So that's a change, but a continuation, I think. Yeah.
Like Gilda said, now there are many big questions and we will have many answers. I just want to say to the audience that we will have approximately 10 minutes towards the end. So 10 minutes before, that will be like 9:20 for question and answer. So just hold your questions, then you will be able to post them to the speakers. But thank you both, and thank you, Gilda, for pointing out that this is like a combination of grievances. But I mean, we have all seen, or many have seen, then the videos coming out of Iran, and I want to ask Marianne, who are these protesters? What is we see all these women? Are they part of an organized feminist movement, or is it a combination of many things?
Well, we've seen that many of the protesters are women, and women have been, in many cases, at the forefront of the demonstrations as well. And on the one hand, yes, they represent a feminist movement in Iran. They build on a struggle that has been going on since the early 1900s. Women have been active in the democratization process in Iran since the constitutional revolution in 1905-06. And from that time and until present, worked for women's rights to vote, to education, work, and in family, with dealing with marriage and divorce, and etc. So this there is a long history of women's activism and engagement in Iran, and that is important, I think, to acknowledge. But on the other hand, there is also something quite new going on, and I think, well, during my stays in Tehran, I've seen many people, women, who negotiate with the hijab. They show a lot of hair, they have a lot of makeup, they have very
kind of hijab.
Yeah, a lot of hair showing, and very tight trousers and mantos and coats, and yeah, so they negotiate with the mandatory hijab. But I've never seen any woman without the hijab in public. Now, in recent years, we've seen occasional pictures of women who have removed their hijab. In 2017, there were this girl on Engelab Street who took off her hijab, tied it to a stick, and waved it in front of a crowd. So there have been these occasional events. But the last couple of months, I think every day there are pictures, videos of women, elderly women, young schoolgirls from every generation, who walk down the streets without hijab, and this is something new. So in one way, the protesters, they don't strike me as activists. It seems more like a grassroots movement in a way. It's more spontaneous. It's people who not necessarily are politically engaged to begin with. And I think in the previous history of the women's movement in Iran, it was more like politicians or professors, journalists who were kind of politically engaged. But now it's a bit different. And we also see that the protests, that they have been spontaneous, popping up, disappearing. And also important to mention, it's not only women, it's also men, particularly the younger generation. And as Gilda mentioned as well, it cuts across social classes, ethnic groups. Yeah, so it's really diverse. Yeah.
Thank you, Marianne. That you used the word popping up, and that's how it appears for, at least for me, if you just look on Twitter or something.
Yeah.
But Gilda, there must be some kind of organization behind. Could you say something about how this mobilization takes place, or do we know anything about that?
I agree with Marianne, and I cannot say that this organization is behind it. I do not agree on that. But there are forms of organization that helps that kind of mobilization happen. So if we go back to where Marianne ended the answer, we can see that the movement has a kind of feministic voice. We can see that the movement, at least part of it, has a very strong feministic memory. For instance, one of very songs that were sung in Iran was the song of women's organization Change for Equality, that later was cited as the boy with the title "I'm a Woman," but it was actually from that time in 2005, made at that point of time by women's organizations in Iran. So it has a kind of memory from that time. But if we need to see how women's movement in Iran changed from 2009 to today, and if we can actually call it a women's movement, the changes we see. For example, in before 2009, there was a lot of activism in Iran, organized by women's activists. But one of the things that happened in 2009, because of the Green movement, the civil society was suppressed severely, and there was no room for activism. Many fled into exile, and many stayed. But those who stayed worked underground or had to stop for some years. The report that women's movement, or those who we know as were very active as part of the women's activists network, they write that in the reports from 2013 to recently, that they have tried to collaborate with reformists on specific rights, but they have often failed to do that. One is that because they cannot mobilize young people as they could do before 2009. The other problem is because the hardliners have the power in Iran, and they don't have much space for negotiation. So another thing that's happened is that the women's rights are often discussed on online platforms more than before. And so how online platforms are organized is that actually a woman's activism, or is personal and individual people that organize and discuss, such as Me Too, hashtag Me Too, that was also discussed in Iran and created debate in Iran and caused some people were actually sent to prison. Some cases were made because of rape that happened in Iran. So that kind of movements created debate in Iran, but it's not coming from the networks of women's movement inside Iran. It comes from online activism. Another type of online women's activism we can see is around the campaign called My Still See, freedom was created by Masih Alinejad, that has created a lot of debate lately because of the issue of hijab. That's what we know probably all about that. And the third one that I think is very important is around women's rights, but not directly, is about mothers' right to seek justice for the children that are dead because of that are imprisoned in Iran, and they have organized themselves often and share their voices online. So the type of organization we see is very different from what we could see earlier, and that's mainly because civil society is suppressed, and reformists have very little space for reform in Iran.
Just a very, very brief follow-up question to that, because that was one of my questions. How open is the, what are the possibilities for online activism? Because you hear sometimes, yeah, so internet is closed down, then it's open again. Has it been consistently a possibility in the last few years for this type of activism?
Yeah, problem is probably in the word activism, what we mean with activism. So when we say activism, it doesn't mean that people are have signed up for some specific action or organization. It's individual debates around some hashtags or some campaigns that are often made outside Iran in diaspora, and then people can follow up and discuss, and that creates debate also in Iran. So I believe that creates another form of seeking rights in Iran. Yeah.
I want to take a little step back to one of the opening remarks made here, reference to the point, to the fact that Masha Amini, or Amin, I would say Amini, but that's probably wrong, was a Kurdish woman. And you have already mentioned that this cuts across class and combines both the less wealthy parts of Tehran in this case, or in the case you mentioned, and the richer ones. But Marianne, you alluded to the fact that Iran is not a fully Persian nation. Could you elaborate a bit on what role the ethnic element plays here?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think a lot of the protests were triggered because many didn't see it as a coincidence that this particular young woman was treated that brutally by the police. Because being a woman and being an ethnic minority, that combination is like a multiple discrimination. And Kurdish women are often treated much harder or brutally than other women. And this goes for the same as other ethnic minorities such as Azeris, Baluchis, Arabs, Lurs, for instance. But perhaps the Kurdish minority has in particular been discriminated against. And we also saw during the first protests that developed that they were extremely brutally met by the regime and by the police. And this is no coincidence either, because the regime obviously feared that it would escalate and cause further disturbances, because it also involved protests on ethnic grounds and could cause for escalating further the situation. So I don't think it's a coincidence that these two elements were triggered the protests in particular. I don't know if you want to add something to that, because we see now the protests are all over Iran, so it's not only the Kurdish areas either, isn't it?
What's that called? this fylke, counties. Yeah,
Yeah, sorry.
31 counties. But what I wanted to add to this is that the very first protest was in Kurdistan in Iran. The day that Masha Amini was buried. And at that day, the slogan "Woman, Life, Freedom" was said loudly. And the same day or next day, we saw protests in Tehran and other places. And but something happened, and happens when slogans move and translates. Woman, life,
yeah.
freedom.
Yeah.
When it says in Kurdish area, it has another meaning when it comes to Tehran and says loudly. So though we see that people in the death of a Kurdish woman creates movement across Iran, but I'm not sure that across Iran can hear the voice of woman in Kurdish area, a Kurdish woman's voice. So what happens, what we see and talk about is often the narratives of urban women. And the voice of a Kurdish woman need to be made and raised in a way that we can hear it as well. And that already there, because of they are women, because of the Kurdish, it won't come to the public spaces that Iranians create through social media or other media in Iran, and make a voice out of it. So I think though we say the same slogan, we don't say the same thing. That's the first thing. But we see something important anyhow, is that we see that the pain of a woman, a Kurdish mother, is important also for a mother in Tehran. So how that happened, that is, you can say that because injustice is so broad that you can feel that pain. But something even more important happened in recent years. Since 2020, I guess you have heard about the flight, the airport. I mean, the flight that was shut down in 2020, and the families of those people that were killed, that they created the organization. And in that organization, there is one man, Hamed Ismailian. He is very famous in Iran because of the writings he had. He has that since the day he lost his family. And he is a writer, first of all. Second, he writes about his pain of a middle-class man losing a dream, a family dream, that is having a successful dream is a dream for any person. Connect that pain to another type of pains that people have experienced because of political injustices in Iran. And he has written about that in at least 2 years now. And he has become very famous because of that. So he gives space for pains that cannot be seen otherwise. And that's very important, especially for Iran, that has always had authoritarian regime, and create a space for other pain that other people that you cannot even see and recognize as important are very important in this process. So I think that that kind of acts that people have in Iranian public spaces are important to recognize that people who die in Balochistan, we hear very little about them. In Iranian imagination, that part of Iran doesn't exist. That's how far it is from the public sphere. That people can write about those pain in this space is very important. And that has happened in recent years. Yeah. So I think that's another aspect of the the diaspora that we see.
Mm.
If I can add another one.
Yeah, please.
But we see another thing in diaspora about the ethnicity, that it has been given space to ethnicities to show their ethnicity during the protests in diaspora. But we see that it comes with creates a kind of conflict, because many believe that they know what Iran is, and and the rights that minorities should have in that Iran, and they want to reduce the visibility of minorities in the protests. And that's an undemocratic process, if you ask me, because we don't know what type of Iran we imagine for future, what type of rights minorities will have in another type of politics and political structure. So we see a lot of conflicts, but also a lot of sympathies for each other. Yeah.
Thank you both. That's actually, you already touched on my or two further questions, because exactly this giving voice is not well, often, sometimes the privilege of students, people connected to universities or higher education, but also to the diaspora. And I wonder if maybe in this case, what role do you see for students, university, higher education, and or the diaspora, or their links to that? Maybe you want to elaborate, Marianne?
Yeah, well, I think in the case of universities and the role that they can play, we've already seen that they have played an important role. There have been a lot of protests among students at universities scattered around Iran, not only Tehran, but also smaller cities and places. So students have been marching, chanting slogans, and also protesting gender segregation and practices at campus. There has not been that many of faculty or professors joining the protests yet. And I think that, tells us that there is a really severe lack of academic freedom at the universities. And there is not really much room to navigate here for students or the faculty. But we've also seen the protests developing in schools. I mean, even children have taken part, so it's that's also something new. Yeah. So I don't know. Do you want to elaborate on the diaspora?
Yeah. Okay, I know I need to go back in time in order to answer this question, because if we look at we go back in 2009 again, the Green Movement and how it created voice inside Iran and outside. At that time, it was very common that you would make a video and pictures and upload it. It could be in any social media. But then very quickly people found out that is not enough. It should be sent back to Iran by satellite, that more people can see it. And needed people who can verify the videos, people who can act on it. So from 2009 to today, we see that Iranians have organized themselves around how to make this voice become heard internationally and inside Iran. So there are people who work to verify these videos. They are often sent to groups of people that now known who these people can be. Masih Alinejad is one of them, for instance. Or there are now TV channels in diaspora that send back these reports from Iran on satellites. Like Iran International is one of them. So then we have organizations like International Human Rights Organization for Iran that are located several places. In Norway, we have one in Norway as well. We have several other places. They gather the narratives, contact people inside Iran. They contact family members to verify if this story is true and make a case. So and then what they do is another issue. But that's how diaspora is important to make the voices be voice, because we know that in this case, in Masih Mahsa Amini's case, we have a journalist that can write about it, but in many other cases we don't have. The same is about ethnicities, ethnic minorities. Who writes about them, and how we can make voice of the injustice that they face. The same is about, you earlier asked about organization, and I think I didn't say anything about, for example, the syndicates, how organization, for example, teacher organizations, how they work, and they have tried to for instance, stop working some days and show protests before this incident and also now, and how they can contact people outside Iran and make their voice heard. Diaspora play a very important role in that part, but after or during the protest, diaspora become much more organized and created protests. And now we see at least protests in 150 cities across the world, organized by Iranians. Yeah.
I think I mean, it's not it's not a very happy topic, but we need to say a little bit about the pretty hardline response of the regime, which is what has also caused the international reactions to recent events in Iran. Why do you think it's been so uncompromising? Is this really about the religious principle of the republic, or is there something else at stake here? You have already alluded to many things at stake.
Yeah, many things are at stake for the Islamic Republic, and like previous protests, we've seen the brutality of the regime once again, and I believe that they are willing to do anything they can to defend the current system. We've seen so far that approximately 300 people have been killed. 40 of them are children. There are 14,000 people who have been arrested. Some of them have already been charged with being muhareb, an enemy of God. So they're not only defying the Islamic Republic, not only the state, but also the religion. And these are serious accusations and often used when to give a death penalty. So yeah, so this yeah will have serious consequences for the protesters, and it's most definitely used also to scare people to prevent further protests. On the other hand, though, it has been very difficult for the police to stop the protests because they've been very spontaneous. And as we see, and I think you mentioned that the first protest after Amini's funeral, the funeral developed into a protest with political claims. And we've seen now In Iran, there is tradition when it's 40 days after someone has died, that people gather and commemorate the dead. So the people who have been killed during the protests have had this kind of ceremonies. And these ceremonies have developed into protests. And it's not illegal to gather to commemorate someone who has died. So it's not something the government can stop. And it's also difficult for them to know where will the next demonstration develop. So there is still some hope in that, but I'm afraid the brutality will, it will be the case this time around as well.
Yeah, I agree. Should I add?
You just agree.
I just agree. I think Marianne explained it well. Yeah.
But then, I mean, if we're coming towards sort of conclusion, if there can be such a thing, if there, you said the regime is willing to do anything, then the question is reform even possible? There has been, at least in the past, elements of reform. How can any form of reform be envisioned in this context which we are in today?
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, I can start.
Yeah.
I think reformists, in the way that are in Iran, the questions and the interests they have, they don't have the power to even negotiate in this situation, because first of all, the hardliner they have, the conservatives, they have much power in Iran, and they have reduced the space and power that reformists had. The second is that reformists have been very much interested in very abstract idea of what reform would be.
What do you
Very
mean by
abstract, because it never went to concrete examples of how the reform could happen. It was more some idea of some rights can change, but what more? And I think the protest that we see now wants much more than what the reformists can promise and are interested to do. And so reformists have problem both in political structure and no muscles to build on in among those who protest now. Another thing, I probably will come back to it because I had one argument, but I forgot. If you continue, I can come back to it.
Okay, yeah. Well, to my knowledge, there has not been any claims of reform this time around. So if we compare to the protests that developed in 2009 with the election that people saw as fraudulent, and the Green movement, the democratic movement that developed after that, there were claims of reform. We have to reform the system and the republic. And then at that time, there was also a reformist, moderate politician, kind of as a leader of the movement. This time, there is no leader. There are no claims of reform, to my knowledge. People are wanting change, a political change, and they're calling for revolution. And I think also there has been, as Gilda mentioned, the conservative turn in politics. Previously, the population had the choice between moderates, reformists, conservatives, and hardliners. Now there are only hardliners left. The last presidential election, no reformist candidate, only hardliners. So there's no possibility in the system anymore. Either the system goes or so it's either or, I guess.
I just remember what I wanted to say about reformists. when I look at the videos, especially young girls make in Iran, they remember reformists' time and the discussions that brought up at that time. One of the things that happened by reformists, the time that reformists had the power in Iran, was that civil society grew a lot. People joined in many different type of social society, like women's movement, like students movement. But at the same time, we have seen that reformists have a kind of short roof because you can only work inside a frame that is accepted by what Iranian call nizam, which is the Islamic Republic, and the way Islamic structure is, I mean, the political structure is built. If you go beyond that, you will be cut. And that happened during this reformist time. Many newspapers were closed down, though many newspapers were also open, but they were also closed. Many intellectuals were killed, though a lot of civil society was active. So you can see that though, so what reformists can do right now, they have a frame that does not fit in the demands of the protests. And the gap is quite huge. I think if reformists want to be active and have a space, they have to negotiate a lot within their own demands and their own interests. But I see a little hope for that.
So this room cannot be gained through protest alone. Is that what you are saying?
I'm saying if reformists want to have more power in Iran through these people that protest, then they need to change a lot of their own demands and what they want out of reform. You see, so the reform what they want and they have talked about and their interest is very different from what people and the protesters want.
And the alternative is the revolutionary path.
Yeah.
That you mentioned. Is that a likely one? Or it's hard to
it's hard
predict
to,
the future.
To predict. It's very hard to predict, but if we look at previous protests and demonstrations, there is a good possibility that, unfortunately, that the demonstrators will, the protests will be put to an end. Yeah.
Probably the question is which institution can organize people, because from going protests, uprising like that to revolution, you need to go to organizing protest, and what institution in Iran can do that? We don't have political parties, not inside, not outside Iran can do that. We don't, but during Islamic revolution, so Islamic and religion was the kind of institution that created the space. But if we want to think about a revolution, then we need to see what type of institution can do that. And I think that families in Iran can be another, a form, very different form, but a form of kind of organizing. We have seen since 2009 that people organize themselves through the grief that they have experienced, and the families organize themselves, and the mobilization that we see outside Iran is often pushed through those organizations. So there might be some type of institutions after all, but we need to see how they develop over time.
Thank you very much, both of you. I'm sure the audience have gathered up questions during the past 50 minutes. We now have about
approximately 8 minutes left. So any burning questions or comments from the audience is now very welcome. På engelsk eller norsk, kan vi vel si.
Jeg kan si det på norsk også?
Ja.
Okay. Nei, angående, for du nevnte det med hvor skal jeg si, life freedom, eller jeg husker den på kurdisk, hvor jeg har kurdisk bakgrunn. Og så vil jeg bare si at jeg satte veldig pris på at du nevnte hvor det opprinnelig kom fra. Fordi jeg føler at i nyhetsartikler og sånn verden over, at det har blitt et kjent slagord, at vi føler at liksom, kurdiske stemmer blir druknet inn i det hele. Så jeg skulle bare si at jeg satte veldig pris på at det var nevnt da. Og så tenkte jeg ikke helt over at det føltes annerledes for kanskje persiske kvinner i Teheran enn for kurdiske i den kurdiske regionen. Så det var også interessant å lære. Og så får jeg veldig mye informasjon, eller informasjon blir gjerne spredt på sosiale medier. Jeg bruker for eksempel Instagram. Og så det kan brukes på godt og vondt angående informasjonsspredning. Men der er jeg litt aktiv, eller der har flere av oss med kurdisk bakgrunn vært aktiv på en måte nevne fødselsnavnet til Masha Amini, som var Gina. Det var det navnet jeg fikk av moren sin. Kurdisk navn. Men hun måtte bruke Masha på grunn av diskriminering av regimet, at det på en måte bare aksepteres persiske navn. Så jeg hadde bare lyst til å liksom legge det til.
Ja, tusen takk.
Flere?
Da lurer jeg på om jeg sniker meg til et lite spørsmål. Jeg lurer litt på i forhold til det, jeg vet i hvert fall at du, Marianne, har litt tanker rundt dette med feminisme i islam. Altså, vi snakker jo om kvinnekamp og aktivisme mot et eller annet, men altså, vanskelig å forestille seg, eller vanskelig å med vestlige øyne se hva mulighetsrom de har for å få til noe, og hva det egentlig er de kjemper mot. Hva er feminisme i et type regime som dette, og en type kultur som den iranske, som ikke er den samme som den vestlige som vi kanskje tenker på når vi tenker på feminisme. Da. Hva er det de tenker på her? Hva er det de vil?
Ja, et stort spørsmål. Feminismen i Iran har jo vært veldig sammensatt, men en del som har vokst frem, særlig etter etableringen av den islamske republikken, har jo vært den islamske feminismen, altså en feminisme som promoterer kvinners rettigheter innenfor rammen av religionen. Og det har kanskje vært på grunn av at den islamske republikken har krevd det, men også fordi at en del religiøse kvinner har ønsket å definere feminisme med utgangspunkt i sin egen religion. Så er det veldig mange ulike krav selvfølgelig som kommer der, men akkurat når det gjelder, hvis vi går tilbake til der det startet da, med denne protesten mot hijab, så har jo det vært et poeng blant veldig mange muslimske feminister at bruk av hijab skal være frivillig. Og det ser vi jo også i Iran, altså helt fra den tidlige perioden av republikken, så var det jo støttespillere av regimet, eller av republikken, som var imot at det skulle være et påbud om bruk av hijab. Og de mente at dette ikke kunne forsvares religiøst sett. Da. Så det er jo interessant. Og så er det jo veldig mange andre rettigheter enn bare det med hijab selvfølgelig, som hektes på, og det ser vi jo også i den feministiske bevegelsen som har utviklet seg nå. Så det handler jo om personlig frihet og selvbestemmelse over egen kropp, og i tillegg til økonomiske og juridiske rettigheter. Så det er veldig sammensatt, men jeg tror det er viktig også å se at det handler ikke nødvendigvis bare om religion heller, denne feministiske kampen i Iran. Da. Det handler også om et autoritært regime.
I was wondering since the protests are mostly, like, it's only in Iran, and it's mostly due to the protesters that it's still ongoing. But I was wondering if you guys have any idea on what the role could be from people outside of Iran, and the international scene that is like also very trying to, like, yeah, there's nothing we can do, I feel like, internationally. But do you know, like, outside of Iran, there's anything that can help the protesters, or is it just the protesters that have to continue going?
Do you want to answer that? Or?
I'm not sure I have any answer, but I think human rights organizations often comes with appeal or ask for certain actions be done, and I think it's best to follow that. But I cannot answer more than that. It's too complicated for me.
Yeah.
It's international politics, and yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's important that we have events like this, that we talk about what's going on, that we follow the protests, that we listen to what their claims are, and yeah, that it's not invisible what happens, and not least how the protesters are met by the regime. So now the protests have been going on for 2 months. There's not many newspapers that write about it anymore. But if we continue to talk about it, and then I think that will definitely help. There are solidarity demonstrations across the world, and I believe also here in Bergen, at least in my city in Stavanger, it's every other Saturday. I think going to those events is important. Yeah. So these small things can be of bigger importance for the protesters, I believe.
I think there was one final question over there.
Hi, you all mentioned a bit about the brutality of the regime. And I just want your comment on the recent events of the first death penalty of one of the demonstrators, one that is probably among many more to come. And the consequences if one, because I can imagine that many of the current demonstrators who are in custody fear for also themselves being handed a death penalty. And it's quite many demonstrators who are in custody. And I'm just wondering if there is 14,000 death penalties to be handed out to these demonstrators, what's the next, and what will this how will this damage civil society and further potential uprising? And also if you've seen any decrease in demonstrations after the first death penalty has been sentenced.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I could try. I mean, it's obviously done to prevent further demonstrations, and I think they will partly succeed with that. But then again, we saw yesterday that there were an increase in protests to commemorate protests from 2019. So I think it's going a bit back and forth at the moment. It's very hard to predict what will happen, but definitely if or when more death penalties will be given, then yeah, I suspect there will be a decrease eventually in the protests. I don't know. What do you think?
If you look at the history, so it's my history of Islamic Republic of Iran, so it's not strange that they will continue. It's not something new. And the death penalty to those who engage in political uprising has happened even when there is no protests. So in that sense, I think it can continue and become much worse. But I see an eager among those who protest that they will continue the protest as well. So in which way and direction it can go, I cannot say. But brutality, I think it will continue.
On that, I would say very sad note, we have to end this meeting for today. I thank the two panelists for coming and speaking today. I thank the audience for questions, comments. And I want to add to say that you're all welcome back here next week to Bergen Global, where there will be 3 breakfast meetings next week. One on what went wrong in Afghanistan, one on opposition in Russia, and one on China-Taiwan relations. And if you want to find more information, you can go to the website or social media of Bergen Global. Thank you very much all.